Welcome to the show, and I'm your host, Greg Fenton. Each week, we explore topics and ideas related to the experience of people with conflict and look to promote the profession of conflict resolvers. We are available to connect with at fentonmediation@gmail.com or at 647-227-4734. Check out the Facebook page for Mediation Station and the group page to ask to become a member. Also visit YouTube channel called Fenton Mediation to see videos of past shows. Listen to podcasts of Mediation Station on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. Please follow us at our Twitter account, which is @Fenton Mediation. The conversation for today is called "The Truth is You Are Right and Wrong." And with me will be Julie McKenna, sitting in the waiting seats there. So the program continues live each Sunday night from 8 to 9 p.m. through Zoom, as we are doing now. We will engage in conversation with everyone attending, able to listen and watch the conversation. Microphones and webcams will be closed, and if anyone wants to contribute anything, there are two options. One is to see the chat icon as a bubble at the bottom center of your screen for you to click to then type in a comment or question and click to send. Or you can click on the reactions icon that's also located at the bottom center of your screen for you to see. You click on the hand icon within the reactions and you will open up your mic. You can speak. We won't open your camera, just your mic. You'll speak your comment or question and then we'll close your mic again. The show is being recorded for both video and audio purposes. That will be uploaded for public access on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts to listen to once the shows are edited. A couple things to present before we get into the meat of our conversation today on truth. Again, truth, yeah. So I have an article, it's brief. 13 detained for membership in criminal underworld, requesting mediation from criminal bosses. So this is in Georgia, Tbilisi, Georgia, not Georgia, the state in the United States. It's the country of Georgia. And it's from June 10th, 2021. The Georgian Interior Ministry has detained 13 individuals for membership in the criminal underworld and requesting the mediation of criminal bosses to settle the dispute. The ministry stated that one of the detainees had a financial dispute with a business partner regarding the distribution of income. The disputing parties appealed to members of the criminal underworld to resolve the matter, after which one of the thieves residing abroad instructed his son to resolve the conflict. MM, as he's known, organized a meeting for the disputing parties on April 16, 2021 in Tbilisi, as a result of which one of the parties was ordered to pay a certain sum in Georgian currency. So I just thought it came to mind about criminal mediation. Interesting concept. Just think about it. Any thoughts on that, Julie?
Well, you do have a lot of experience, Greg, so perhaps you can see if you might have any openings in your schedule to help with that.
I was just wondering what you're talking about, me as a criminal or me as a mediator?
Either one.
Just seeking clarification there.
Depends on your perspective, I think, Greg.
Very good. Hey, very good segue. Though I have one more thing to mention here. Little posting, Family Mediation Practicum Ontario. There's another option available for individuals looking to become accredited as a family mediator in Ontario. Ontario Association for Family Mediation, OAFM, is now providing that 80 of the 100 hours of practicum experience can be completed using simulated cases. The final 20 hours of the practicum must be completed with real clients. Family Mediation Practicum Ontario is providing, through its OAFM approved course, this experience starting this fall, 2021, by using realistic scenarios with the 80 hours counting towards accreditation. All classes are online with real-time feedback. For more information, check out the webpage, familymediationpracticum.pccs.ca. All right, so tonight we're going to, well, so there's already a question from the crowd. Can there be criminal mediations? Are you asking us, person in the crowd? Maybe we'll ask about that together to get accredited. Oh, yeah. Well, that's another profession of mediation to open up as an opportunity. Let's unpack this first, and then we can segue into that criminal mediation conversation soon. Welcome back, Julie. Appreciate you visiting again. You were here, I don't know, a couple of months ago, and we had a conversation on truth. Truth is a really strong piece for you.
It is.
Yeah. So somebody, in the crowd also asked about that. Let's see. Trying to follow this. Is that kind of restorative justice? Not quite, person. I'm not calling you out unless you ask me or give me permission to out you. So Julie, with regard to the whole thing about truth, what is it with you about truth?
It's a good question that you ask. And I think that these days we can look around at any given number of events that are transpiring in the world. And it seems that there's definitely a digression in terms of people's conceptions compared with reality. So I think that there is a conflict with regards to people's perspectives in terms of accepting and appreciating what the truth is in an objective measure.
That's a lot to unpack for me.
Is that your perspective?
Well, at this point, yeah. You're going to have to really educate me and inform me so that I might be transitioning myself to another perspective of truth and perspective. I know we've had a couple of past shows that have focused on truth, and this is the third. I'm not sure if we'll do any more. Of course, truthfully, we'll have to figure that out. So how do people deal with the idea of truth from your perspective?
I think that people oftentimes have the conception that it's a propositional approach, that it's either my truth or it's your truth. And I think that neglects to mention what people's experience of that truth is. It's not necessarily fair to say that something's happened and my experience of whatever that was is going to replace your experience. Instead, I think what we fail to do is have a more enriched conversation, which would be something like, what was it that happened and how did it impact you? And I think by understanding that impact is different than intent and it's different than experience, I think that it encourages all of us to have a more open and honest conversation. And I think when we're having such a conversation, I think that that's where the opportunity for transformation can happen, rather than having the same conversation over and over again in terms of it's my way or it's your way, which only results in more anger and more frustration and more bitterness and in fact more separation. It doesn't get us to where we want to be, and it doesn't have the results that we're looking for. So that's why I do in fact keep coming back to the truth.
Isn't it though that when people talk about truth and perspectives and the connection with conflict, that people feel they're right and the other person is wrong, and that the other person's perspective really doesn't matter?
We've all had that conversation, and we've all been on the other side of having had that conversation had with us. And I think that the commonality is that we've had that conversation. We know what that experience is. We know that it fosters negativity. We know that it fosters further separation. And we know that it fosters further entrenchment in terms of position, rather than a mutual reciprocal exchange of ideas. And so when we start from a place of, I'm right and you're wrong, I think we've already had that conversation in all of our lives, whether it be at work, whether it be personal, professional, whatever it happens to be. And so what I would suggest, and I think you would suggest, Greg, is that we need to reconsider the purpose of our conversation. Is it just simply to regurgitate the conversations that we've already had? Or is there an opportunity to have a new conversation where in fact there is an exchange of ideas?
You know, as you know from your background, your training, to your education, with mediation and conflict resolution, that, a lot of this stuff that we talk about is about positions. And positions are really seen as right and wrong. I'm right, you're wrong. So if we ask one person that, and we hear their story, their perspective, we say, wow, that's so impactful. Then if we were to approach and ask the other person involved, they might say the same thing about the other person. They're right and the other one's wrong. And so the positional perspective becomes really more entrenched when people continue on that path. How do you try to get people out of the positional perspective that, they're right, the other one's wrong?
That's a conversation that I think we've all had, and I think we've all had too many times. And I think that we can all appreciate that it doesn't give us the satisfaction or the resolution that we're looking for. And in fact, we oftentimes end up having that same conversation over and over and over again and become further and further frustrated. And so what I would suggest instead is to pause for a few moments and to get our own selves ready for the conversation and to understand, why are we even going to have this conversation? Is it simply to reframe my words that I've already said? In that case, it may be better to write a letter, because one might argue that you're not going to be engaging in any listening.
A letter to who? Sorry.
To whomever you're in conflict with, right? If you're not going to be listening, if it is that situation that you're describing, it's either my way or it's your way. It negates the purpose of having a conversation. A conversation is, in theory, it's supposed to be a dialogue. It's supposed to be an exchange of ideas. It's supposed to be, this is what I thought. How did it experience you? What are your thoughts? Whereas oftentimes when we're in this position that you've described, Greg, that it's my way or it's your way, I find that we oftentimes just repeat ourselves over and over and over again, and we just get further and further frustrated. And we end up having that same conversation over and over again. And the more time passes, the more it proceeds. So what I would suggest is pausing and getting ourselves ready for the conversation. Starting to think about, why do we want to have this conversation? And how is it that we might proceed in a way that's going to be constructive? We know all the ways that don't work. And we need to be open-minded and understand that there are other ways that, in fact, do work. But it's not going to be an easy process. And keyword there, process. It's not just one conversation.
And I appreciate what you're saying. And I understand from my experience in education. At the same time, when we're engaging with people, and let's say we're, the third person in the process that try to help facilitate an opportunity for this dialogue to happen, people are so stuck at that point. They're so entrenched in their position of being right. And with that right, they extend that the other's perspective, the other side is wrong. And then you have the other perspective saying the same thing. And as you mentioned too previously, that the longer this goes on too, it becomes that much more entrenched. It becomes harder to get people to move out of these positions. And it's easy for us to say conceptually, you need to do this, or try this, or do this. I really believe in the whole culture of mindset drives behavior. I'm not there to try to seek to get people to change their behavior. I'm more about people appreciating the perspective of what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and how they're processing the actions and the behavior of another person relative to their own that's come into, quote, this negative conflict. How do you really get to, how do you get people to appreciate what you're trying to say and what you want to encourage them to go to with this approach that you're talking about?
It starts with you. So if you're going to ask somebody else to listen, you're going to have to be in a mindset that forces you to listen to something that you are diametrically opposed to. You're going to have to appreciate that if your expectation of another is something different than what's happened in the past, you can't come to this conversation by behaving in the same way that you've always behaved in. You're going to have to do something differently. And so the conversation is going to have to start with the conversation that you have with yourself. And it goes down to the purpose of that conversation. It is easy for us to look at another person and their actions and to make assumptions and to inject what it is that our judgments are on them. And maybe they've threatened a piece of our own identity in terms of something that they've said. And maybe that's what's really gotten us very protracted in this disagreement. And maybe we need to think about that and understand how it is that the other person's words and or actions have impacted us, and how it is that we may simply be reacting to something that this conflict is not even about. And that's where the truth comes into the conversation, that oftentimes we may be having the wrong conversations about the wrong subjects and perpetuating the distance between ourselves. And so that's why I think it's very important to have the objective standards and the conversation with ourselves prior to even sitting down and having that conversation with another.
Sounds like the concept of openness is involved with a lot of this process. Is that something that you identify with?
That is the only way that I think we can move from positions to interests as we learn about moving from theory to practice. So I've mentioned that it is important for us to have that conversation with ourselves, to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of this conversation? If it is going to be simply to regurgitate all of the things that we've already said and to hear the other person say all of the things that they've already said, I think we both know that that's not very productive. And I think we both can assume where it is that that conversation is going to go. And so by having that pause in the conversation and having a look at ourselves and understanding that we just don't know everything, that maybe there is a misinterpretation in terms of ourselves, that we're looking at another person and we're ascribing these values and these judgments to them, that maybe that's not the accurate truth. And so for openness, we have to appreciate that my experience is not going to be negated by your experience. I can completely fundamentally disagree with whatever it is that you're saying, but I can still hear you, and I can still acknowledge what it is that you're saying, and I can still acknowledge whatever the impact is that that's had on you, even when I don't agree. And that's another piece that I have to get myself prepared for. I have to appreciate that I'm comfortable enough with myself to realize that I need to be open, that if I want to have change, I'm going to need to change in addition to expecting change from another.
So that, that whole thing, as I presented about openness, and you've presented about the thought that, when people hear certain words, they identify meaning, and that they feel threats from certain words, the connotation of the truth. Whose truth is it? How can there be more than one truth in a perspective or a situation? I have my truth, you have your truth. That's what we talk about tonight with the title. I'm right and you're wrong. That gives a dimension that there's possibility of being right and wrong with the same thing.
It is, and oftentimes that does happen. And I think what that comes down to is our experience and our interpretation. You and I may have gone through the exact same scenario, but my past experience is going to be different than yours. So what something might happen to me and might have very profound impacts on me, that might be insignificant to you, and it might be meaningless to you. And you would be completely unaware of what my background was and what it is that these things meant to me. So again, that comes to us having judgments about other people, that we think that somebody else either feels the same way that we do, and therefore they should know without us having to say something, or that they should just simply understand, or that they're doing this intentionally. Whereas the truth might be that they had no idea. They're completely unaware of whatever the situation was. And by having the same conversation, rather than the one that you and I are proposing, it's going to lead to the same results that we've always had.
Which is a negative situation being reinforced with the continuing dialogue that's all about I'm right and you're wrong.
Exactly, which is why I suggest maybe it's better to just write a letter, right? Rather than listening, right?
I think, though, that could present a challenge because, how we put together the words, the framing, the messaging, it may come across, from the one perspective. And then when the other person is in receipt of that and they process what they're reading, they might feel threatened also. I mean, if you can't speak it, yeah, write it. Though, how can we get our mindsets to shift the conversation from being oral to being written?
I think so. I should have clarified, Greg. I think the idea of writing the letter is more for ourselves to maybe not ever send it, but just simply to write down what it
Oh,
is. Clearly,
okay.
we're very entrenched in whatever the position is that we're in. And it can be very difficult when we're dealing with a counterpart that is as convinced of their truth, which is diametrically opposed to ours as is possible. So sometimes we're not necessarily aware of all of the different implications that whatever the situation is has had on us. And so sometimes by writing some things down, it can be clarifying for us, and it might make us look at things in a different way, or it might highlight some of the things that we hadn't necessarily considered previously.
So it's more like a journal or a diary of some form for our own purposes rather than for the intention directly of sending a message through the letter or the email to the other person involved. So it's like, okay, I can't deal with this. If I continue to have this conversation, it's just going to become more problematic. So let me take this pause, step to the side, or as William Murray says, go to the balcony and take an overview of what's going on to what's not going on, and write down my thoughts, my feelings with regard to the circumstance and situation. And then work that, think about it, process it, see how productive it might be or how productive it's not going to be. And then reframe it in some way. And then maybe revisit the connection or the dialogue with the other person.
And start asking some questions that
Like what?
maybe maybe we're injecting a lot of judgments in terms of whatever the situation is. Maybe we've established that the other person has terrible motivations and a terrible intention towards us, and that they're motivated to hurt us. They're motivated to do something that they are intentionally trying to cause us harm. Sometimes when we look at something when it is in a different format than we're used to, so for example, the letter idea, it aids us in looking at things in a new way, and it aids us in preparation for getting ourselves ready for that different kind of a conversation which we're both proposing, rather than having that same conversation again. Maybe by the act of writing and looking at the information that we've put down and starting to ask some questions and wondering, have I ascribed some values and or some judgments to the other person? Is it possible that I'm not right? How did I come up with those ideas? Is it possible that I've put some bias in here based on my own past experience and my own past hurts? Is it possible that I'm not solving the right problem here? Is it possible that I'm bringing my past to the present? Is it possible that there is another way? Is it possible that this conflict that is in my mind has nothing to do with this other person that is in front of me?
Those are a lot of questions, and they're reflective questions. It's all about self-awareness, connecting with oneself to what's happening, to what possibly may not be happening, and then looking to try to create a pathway to make things happen differently. I'm just concerned that how open is the individual to really be that introspective, to question and challenge themselves, to then be open and somewhat to say, I'm doing something wrong here. Yeah, I might feel I'm right. At the same time, upon reflection, maybe there's something I could do differently. I'm just, from my lived experience, sort of challenge the people to take clear ownership of that too simply and too easily.
It is difficult to do. And our natural tendency is to be defensive and to say that I'm right and you're wrong. That's our natural inclination as humans. It's maybe a defense mechanism, whatever it is, that is something that is very traditional and it's very standard for all of us. Additionally, there's the confirmation bias that we're always seeking to find ways that we're right. We're always going to look at information that confirms what it is that we're saying, and something that may challenge what it is that we're saying, we're going to dismiss that and say that it's inaccurate or whatever judgment we can come up with. And so understanding that we're doing things in a particular way and it's gotten us a particular set of results. We're not satisfied with that. We can choose to carry on that path, no problem, but that's a choice, and that's a choice that we've made. And we can't expect different results if we're not going to be doing anything differently. Whereas if we can come to the conclusion that, in fact, it's possible that there's another way, it's possible that there can be a more constructive method of proceeding, it's not going to be a productive conversation to start from the place that you've already started from. As we mentioned earlier, you're going to have to do something different, and you're going to have to accept that you're going to have to take some steps to be more self-aware and to be more mindful, because at the end of the day, a conflict involves more than one person oftentimes, and it's almost guaranteed that both parties have contributed to the conflict, that it's not just one party. We're always trying to find out who's the victim and who's the villain, but life doesn't necessarily work like that. Oftentimes we can play both roles, maybe simultaneously.
Yeah. So I want to put it out to the crowd. If anyone wants to ask a question or make a comment, we'd welcome the opportunity to have the contribution to help expand, deepen, broaden this conversation tonight. Truthfully, that's honestly from my perspective. I just want to ask you, Julie, do you know anyone in your circle named Laura? Just as a
I
first
do.
name? You do?
Well, we have Laura helping us.
Not that Laura. She counts, of course, for sure. In your own circle.
I don't think so.
Okay. I asked because, there could be a Zoom bomber. We talked about this earlier,
We did.
the truth that we've had a couple of Zoom bombers. And I feel, well, is that some kind of recognition that people want to take that time and make that effort to involve in our conversations through the course of the program? So I'm just checking in. I didn't want to disrespect if you had somebody in your circle that was Laura, because this person is also trying to open their mic. So that's a cue for us to be mindful. Anyways, let's continue our conversation. And why do we even use the word truth? Like, what's the point of having a word that provides and creates such friction in our vocabulary and in our interactions with people? I know the courts are based on a judgmental thing, which is about right and wrong, truth and blame. Why do we even need that word? Is there another word that we could use?
Do you have another word in mind, Greg, before I answer?
Oh, I'm glad. I like how you shift that back to me. I don't know. I'm just reflecting. Oh, I'd like to ask you first.
So I think that you can't escape the truth. And I think that there is a necessity for us to engage with the truth. And it is fair to say that your experience over the years may have changed your perception of a particular experience that you may have had. And so your experience at that time with that information that you had at that time with whatever else was going on in your life, it doesn't negate the fact that you went through that experience. And it doesn't negate the fact that you made your evaluations based on the information that you had at the time. By using the word truth and by adhering to its standards, appreciating the fact that one person's interpretation and experience of that truth may be starkly different from another person's, it doesn't escape the fact that by operating from the truth and objective standards, that's what really aids in the resolution of a conflict. If each of us are coming to the table with our own situation and we're not dealing with the truth, maybe we're dealing with something else. Maybe we're dealing with, whether it be denial or an agenda, whatever it happens to be. By abstaining from living in the truth, it doesn't allow us to solve the right problem with the right solution. So as authoritative as the word connotes, I agree, it is necessary at the same time. So rather than replacing the word, I would consider adding, what is your experience of the truth? What impact did the truth have on you?
Or if I may add, that, okay, you've mentioned the word truth, for example. We're in the midst of a process and someone's repeated the word truth possibly more than one time. So that for me is a cue that I need to connect with that to get more information, to understand their quote perspective. So I might open the question and say, I've heard you present the word truth. What do you mean by that? What does truth mean to you? Is that something that you would, is it you're looking to sort of probe and get a deeper perspective of?
Certainly. And you mentioned that if the person has brought it up numerous times,
Mm-hmm.
that to me would also indicate that the person has not felt heard and they've not felt acknowledged. So I think it would be incumbent on either yourself or myself to ask them, what does it mean to you and what impact has it had on you? And even though it doesn't necessarily change the situation or the scenario, the simple act of being heard allows that individual to be in a position where they've they've said what they need to say. Now they're in a position where they can listen. When that person is reiterating the same thing over and over again, they're not in a position where they can hear what the other party is saying. So it is essential. That's a cue that I like to use, is that when I keep hearing the same thing said over and over again, I know that we can't progress until we pause and we actually have that conversation. We acknowledge both sides or all sides, whomever may be involved, and that gives all of us the opportunity to move forward.
So that's about the active listening skills. You know, you're hearing what's being said to wonder what that represents, to what hasn't been said about that. So you're asking the open-ended questions, the who, what, where, when, why, and how, and being mindful that when we ask a question like to have someone unpack that, why do you say that word? Sometimes that word, that kind of question can come across a little bit too judgmental in some way, and people can get a reaction to that. So why do you ask me that? So, you know, the framing of the questions and the open-ended perspective of that is so integral, I think, for getting people's perspectives to move from positions to interest. Because when it's a closed or leading question, and when you just mentioned about someone repeating the same word, i.e. truth, it shows that they haven't necessarily opened themselves to be receptive to the other person's perspective. And they're still focused solely on trying to get their word out, their quote, their truth. And so tapping into that is the opportunity for them to be acknowledged first, to then say, okay, you are hearing me in some way. And now by asking me this question, what do I mean by that? You're showing you care to want to know what I mean by that.
It's disarming, I think. I think when people find themselves in that situation, it's because they feel threatened, and it tends to get them to be very defensive. And so by stepping in as a mediator and asking them, I've heard you say this, tell me a little bit more about that. Let's hear about how that impacted you. It allows the individual to be transparent in terms of whatever it is that they're going through at that time.
So with truth, you know, we talk about perspectives, and we talk about trying to get people to be open to consider that there's, quote, more than one truth. There's more than one perspective, the same situation, the same lived experience. What if you have this sense that the other person is so fundamentally untruthful that they're, quote, lying to some extent? How can you engage in a conversation to want to get even their truth?
That does happen. And there are people that have bad intentions, that their intent is to cause harm on you or somebody else. We have to be mindful of that. That's a reality that we live with every single day. And that does speak to the necessity of objective standards. So by establishing that it's not going to be my decision necessarily, it's going to not be your decision necessarily, but we're going to jointly make a decision based on these objective standards, that engages fairness for everyone. And I think that's the benefit of mediation as well, is that it allows all of us to be, it allows both parties that are engaged in the conflict to be creating the solution rather than having it imposed on us.
Okay, we have a question from the crowd, and it's toward you, Julie, and you have to be truthful with this, of course. Uh, I would like to know how Julie is so well coiffed during these pandemic times. Tell the truth.
You're very kind. It's dark lighting here.
Hey, anybody want to, did you want to add to that person from the crowd? She told the truth, okay? We'll have to leave it at that.
And Greg, to be fair, my
Yeah.
perspective would be that you're better coiffed than I am.
I'm not sure. So let's unpack what's coiffed mean.
I tended to.
Well, I have less to coif than you do. She further adds, I haven't had a hair appointment in 8 months. So I think there's some envy here. I'm not going to say jealousy. That might be too judgmental. That, Julie, you have a way of presenting yourself in a physical nature that really is about projecting a perspective that I think this person in the crowd would really appreciate for their own. Is there something you could share for them?
YouTube videos are great for learning how to do things for yourself. That's one thing I will say.
And someone else added, haha, is that your truth? Everything we're talking about here, it's totally truthful. We're very transparent people here.
I love the perspective and I love the truth that we're experiencing here.
Yeah, and it's like, and I've used this quote nickname for you, the TruthMeister, because you have this passion for the truth. Okay, so no, never take scissors or dye to my own hair. All right.
Greg does.
Yeah, truthfully. I'm looking, actually, I'm follically deprived. I'm wondering if anyone does take their shears to themselves, that they could actually save that and then donate it to me. So, speaking about COVID, how has COVID-19 affected people's perspectives about truth? What's your perspective of that?
I think that it really calls to mind the evidence of the confirmation bias. So all of us are looking at the same information, and I should add a caveat with that. We're choosing to look at specific information. We're all privy to the same information, but we may focus on what it is that suits our own interpretation and what it is that we believe to be the truth. So when it comes time to the world and the whole situation that we're dealing with, what I find most striking is that there's such a divergence in terms of people's interpretation with COVID, whether it be true or false. And in fact, if it is real, how it is that it should be dealt with. We can look at multiple different countries that have enacted many different theories, and we can see what the end results are. And yet there are still people that argue that and say that the truth is not being reflected. And people on every side of the argument, because it seems that every day there's a new argument, are going to look for information that is going to confirm their own position rather than have a discussion in terms of what doctors and what scientists and all the others might be saying. And I think that comes, sorry, Greg, that seems to come to mind with the truth, because it seems that each side is not respecting the idea, is not feeling heard that their truth or the objective truth is being acknowledged. It seems that every side is convinced of an agenda which is not suitable to their own interests.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reality, that when people talk about their truth and they're feeling that they're right and the other's wrong, and this whole concept of acknowledgement, that people have to, as we talked earlier today, about the openness to consider that, quote, there could be more than one truth to the same lived experience and perspective, that the whole concept of acknowledgement is a skill set that I think is lacking. And people may interpret or process acknowledgement as being in agreement with. So, we talk about the COVID thing, whether it's true or not, and, whether it's happening or it's a fallacy or it's an agenda by some group. And so you just mentioned about acknowledgement, providing value for that person. It's not the same as equating that you're in agreement with them. It's about creating that space to open the conversation, to go deeper within, for that person to share so that we can learn and hear of and about each other. And so I think the skill set of acknowledgement really needs to be something that could be projected and included. So we have a couple of questions. Let's see. What is your perspective when two people feel they are right and the other is wrong? That's one. Oh, let's deal one at a time. I don't want to layer the questions here. As we call, stack the questions.
So when each person is convinced of the truth of their own position,
yeah,
that is probably the most common way that we find ourselves in conflict with another. So in that scenario, I would suggest that we each need to individually have a conversation with ourselves about what is the situation that's at hand, what does it mean to us, get our own selves prepared for what it is that the conversation is going to be. And when it is time to sit down and have that conversation with the other person, come up with a unit of measure that's going to be the objective standard, whether it be the law, whether it be science, whether it be medicine, whether it be whatever it can possibly be. There has to be some objective standard. If it's a very serious, very contentious issue, then that would be my suggestion. And when it is time for that dialogue and that conversation, it's not simply about the truth. I think it's more about what does it mean and what has this experience meant for you and what has it meant for me. You and I can both read a contract, Greg, and that's great. But what that contract really comes down to is its meaning. It's not just simply about the contract itself.
And yet again, the two perspectives, the two positions could have different meanings to the same contract. They process the same words to have a different meaning relative to their own understanding of things and their own experience with that. So let me revert back to also some more stuff is coming fast and furious from the crowd here. There's one that suggestion prep for a future program on COVID. What's the truth? We talked about that. I
would love to be part of that one.
Well, we had that conversation before we went quote live. And
right.
So I put that out there for you to truthfully explore, and we'll see how we can put together something that will provide a very powerful conversation, I believe. Let's see. I truly enjoy this topic. Truth is based on each individual perspective. I think it's sad sometimes because people's ego are more important than learning or growing. Agreeing to disagree is very healthy. That's a comment. I'm getting a little, I need a little lubrication here.
So I agree with the comment that ego can definitely get in the way. And I think sometimes that can be a bit of a defense mechanism, masking maybe our identity. Maybe that other person has felt very strongly. Maybe you've accused that person of being inconsiderate. And maybe that person prides themselves on always being considerate. And so maybe you've touched a nerve on them and they're a bit raw about that. So it can manifest itself as being ego, most certainly. And, you know, there's a good number of times that, in fact, it is ego. But there are also times where that might be a mask and it might be a disguise for negating what the true issue is at hand.
Sounds like you have some empathy in you. Is that truthfully?
I try to have awareness and I try to be objective. I try to understand the rationale of why people behave in the manner that they do, regardless of how much I may disagree with them. I'm a firm believer that whatever lens they're operating from, they're employing logic, something that makes sense to them. And even though I don't agree with it, I want to understand it.
Yeah, you're providing a space and a place for people to open up and share. Comment, yes, people who are more concerned about the economy and the effects of the restrictions than they are about the chances of becoming infected and terribly sick, dying or being on a ventilator, or infecting someone else who may become very sick or die. When they experience the restrictions as their problem rather than the abstract idea of getting sick, they have more cognitive dissonance. So hearing that, what comes to mind for you?
So it highlights for me the importance of truth, that we're literally dealing with matters of life and death, and we can't agree on the facts, and we can't agree on the interpretation of those facts. And we're a year and 3-4 months in, and we're still in the same position. We're still having the same conversations over and over again.
Well, I mean, is it really about us trying to convince another person who has a differing perspective that they're wrong and we're right, relative to having these differing perspectives and that we can agree to disagree?
Well, in this matter that we're discussing right now, I think this is one of the most serious matters that we can be discussing, given that it does legitimately deal with life and death for people. The idea that we have to come up with some sort of sense of an agreement in order to move past the situation that we find ourselves in now, I think that's a conversation that's been missing from wider society, that people who are looking at information to deny COVID or to be very frustrated with the restrictions or to say that, you know, there's a 1% chance of dying with COVID or whatever it is that the facts are that these individuals are citing, it doesn't escape the end result that at the end of the day, people are dying, people are getting very ill, people are having long-term effects. So it's fair to say that we need to do better than the way we've been doing things.
Yeah, but at the same time, who's to determine that? I mean, you've mentioned a few times about using independent criteria somewhat to evaluate or assess things. If the two people can't even agree on having a conversation that could be informative for each perspective, how are they going to even agree on some external criteria that's going to be the gauge or measurement for, quote, the perspectives of being somewhat truthful or not truthful?
And so I think I'd have to reject the question and say that it's not who is going to make the determination, it's going to be how is the determination going to be made. So there's going to have to be an accepted process with that, and it wouldn't be fair to say who is going to be making that determination. I think a more important question is going to be how.
I appreciate you pushing back at me. That's fine. Totally. Truthfully. At the same time, I'd say if, you know, you talk about the how, which is really critical. If someone is not open to hearing that, it has to be presented, from my experience, in some manner so that they will at least give it a space to be open to hearing. And then you can figure out the how, because, you know, when I said who's going to be the determining factor, somehow there has to be a process of defining the criteria for that, the independent criteria, the measurement.
So it's going to have to be context specific. Regretfully, there's not a universal one size fits all answer. It is going to have to be dependent on what it is that's going on. So if we're talking about COVID, to be fair, I don't work in the medical profession, so it would be unfair. I would be an inappropriate authority to making any of those judgments, but I can definitely have some pretty strong opinions. And even in terms of the infrastructure with how those decisions are being made, we're all free and able to be asking questions and to be asking the questions in terms of how is it that these decisions are made, and mindful of the idea that at the end of the day, it's all in all of our best interest to allow the doctors to be making the decisions coupled with everyone else's interests.
So comment, agree to disagree sometimes makes one feel like you don't want to handle or push through to the end. Mind you, it's a great solution, and I find it productive to keep the peace sometimes.
It can be, and sometimes that's what we have to do. And it can also be maybe an act of pressing pause. By agreeing to disagree, the situation is never truly resolved. And there may be another way of asking some questions about what that subject matter at hand actually is. and seeing what it is that's contributed and how each of us in that situation may have contributed to that. So again, I keep going back to the idea that we have to have a different conversation, and that means that we have to prepare ourselves for that conversation. And if we're going to expect that another person is going to behave differently, we ourselves are going to have to behave differently. And when we come to the conversation and we are open and we are receptive and we are curious, that's going to persuade the other person that we're sitting at the table with. Whereas if we sit down and we're immediately angry and combative and defensive and negating everything that the other person is saying, what's likely to happen in that situation? Are we going to progress? Not likely. We're going to end up in the exact same protracted conversation and dialogue that we've always been in.
Or I would even say we'll actually be in a worse situation, because the longer situations go on unresolved and are negative and problematic, they become more entrenched and layered, and it gets harder to try to help people to navigate through those to get hopefully to a better place. We do live in a society that's out there that has these differing perspectives about the same thing. So we have a way that does, manage us to cope with it. I mean, is that really the construct that we want for our society overall?
We need to ask the questions, and we need to consider the context. We need to consider the idea that what's worked for us in one situation is not necessarily going to work for us in another situation. If it's a matter of life and death, we're going to have to make a decision immediately, and it's going to have to be made, and we're going to have to get everyone else to engage with us instantly, no questions asked. And that happens, right? If it's a matter of us preparing for the future and coming up with ideals and what it is that we're hoping to do, we're going to have a different kind of a conversation. But at the end of the day, regardless of what the conversation is, I do agree that we need to have a different kind of a conversation that establishes that we've not been satisfied with the conversations that we've been having. And this is going to be difficult for all of us, myself included, but we're part of it. We've brought half of the situation to the conflict. And by not acknowledging that and not realizing what our tendencies are and how it is we may be influencing another person, that also is simply protracting and distancing us further from the other party.
So what I'm hearing from what you said is that when people are in conflict, let's just say in general, and it's a statement, a generalization of some form, that when there's this experience that people process the moments as being not very productive, having someone else involved, that the people involved have all contributed in some form to the circumstance. It may not be intentional. There may be circumstances where people just don't know, haven't made the effort to try to know, and through, let's say cultural differences. I'm not privy to awareness about everything about everybody, as I believe most people are not. Though I try to make a conscious effort to try to learn about differing perspectives, especially culturally, ethnically, from my own. At the same time, we still engage and interact with people. And those have consequences, those have impacts. We still navigate through them, though they can have a legacy. There's an impact that can be prolonging. So, you've had this journey with truth for a while. We presented a few shows on different dimensions and different aspects. How long do you think this journey is going to go for you? When are you going to find the truth?
I think it's a lifelong journey for all of us. And Greg, I'll share something small with you. So oftentimes when I'm working, I'll listen to different music mixes in the background. And there's one particular song that it's very popular, and it seems to have been in a lot of different mixes that I've heard over the past, let's say, 10 years or so. So I've always liked this song. It's kind of fast. It seems very upbeat and progressive. And, just hearing it, it kind of makes you happy because I just really like this particular song. So on YouTube, sometimes they'll just play things that they think that you're going to like. So one day I was at home and I was doing something else and just kind of listening to this mix in the background. And I kind of paused for a moment, and I heard that there was an interviewer and he was interviewing this particular artist, and she was giving the context of why it was that she wrote this particular song and why it was that she performed it. And so what had happened was that a very good friend of hers, when she was about 13 years old, they were at the beach and her friend unfortunately drowned. And so this song is about the last moments of her friend's life. And even still telling that story, I got chills. I had never heard the song that way. And so having heard the artist tell her story and what it meant to her, it entirely transformed every next time that I heard the very same song. Nothing changed, Greg. The song, the lyrics, none of that changed. It was me that was different. It was the context, it was the understanding. It completely changed the impact that that very same situation, the very same song had on me.
And that to me is fundamental to the journey that we try to do. You know, let's say is my role as a professional in the world of conflict and its resolution. It's not just about getting people to get a skill set. It's to get comprehension, to get connection with the perspective of the concept, rather than just give a skill, give an explanation and information that people can process to make sense of. And that's where what I've heard you say about the song, yes, technically it's the same song. You don't process that song the same way anymore because you've got more information. You've gotten a deeper insight about what's the underlying perspective of the person who wrote the lyrics or the, you know, the melody itself, and what that means to her. And you now have processed that to make sense of it in a different perspective than what you knew. It was just a song before,
Right.
and it resonated with you. Now it has context, and for me, context is about meaning. It gives perspective to that song.
Definitely. And to connect that with the truth for this particular artist, that was her first breakout song. So she put something out that was very, very, very personal for her. She put herself in a very strong position of vulnerability. And she shared that with the world, and it connected with the world, and it connected with me.
Are you open to being truthful about what song it is?
Yes, it's called Carry Me Away by Emma Hewitt. She's an Australian artist.
Okay.
Tell me your perspective
Uh,
once you hear it.
Well, yeah. So, Laura, could you type that out? What's so everyone would know? And I, you know, I have brain cramps, so I may forget it. Truthfully, you want to repeat that, Julie? Just
Yes, so it's called Carry Me Away
yeah,
by Emma Hewitt, and she's an Australian artist.
Hewitt, maybe.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, all right, that's cool. For sure, maybe we can make it viral in some way. You know, go back and get this out there. That's right. What does having this conversation mean for you? I usually ask that of people who come on to have the conversation, because we have focused on truth with you a few times, and who knows what the next time will be, truthfully. So what does this mean to you, and how do you feel that this has any value for anybody watching or listening?
I would connect it to my example with the song. It's a process. It is first, I think we need to be asking some questions and maintain that idea of being mindful about ourselves and our own behavior, and appreciating, although it's very difficult, that we also have contributed to the conflict in maybe not such a positive way. And by allowing ourselves to accept the fact that we're not perfect, that we can be doing some things better, that there is opportunity for growth and for improvement, I think it calls to mind for all of us having this conversation, the importance of the truth, that our experience of the situation is colored by our background and by our experience.
Absolutely. I totally connect with that conceptually and as a reality that we're all products of our lived experiences from the past and how people process their current moments and how they foresee their future moments. It's based on a template of what's already happened to me and how have I been affected from it and with it, and what have I done with it or not.
Right.
Yeah. And so, how do you see your journey with truth developing at this point? What do you want to do with it?
I haven't figured that out yet, but I'm definitely going to carry on. One of my favorite things to do is to engage in dialogue with people that have absolutely completely different expectations and experience and perspectives than I do. And so that's why for me, COVID is so insurmountable. There are so many different perspectives, and I do my very best to try and understand all of them. But I'm
So
not sure what it is.
why would you want to have these conversations that are with people who are so contrary to your own point of view? Like, why do you want to put yourself in that kind of place?
I'm not trying to persuade them of my rightness and their wrongness. And conversely, I'm not interested in being persuaded of their rightness or my wrongness. It's more a matter, I believe that people are intelligent naturally. I believe that people naturally want to help other people. And I believe that naturally people are good, that they want to see good results in their life and in the lives of others. Of course, we can have a different conversation that it's not always true. But as a general rule, I think that that's fair. And so when people are making judgments and they're coming up with these ideas, I believe that it's from what they believe to be fact. And so that's what I'm very much interested in trying to understand is how it is that individuals have come up with these conclusions. And I don't think that we're going to have a constructive conversation by telling somebody outright that they're wrong. Oftentimes they come to that conclusion on their own, or maybe we come to that conclusion that we're wrong about something on our own.
So when you're suggesting that you're open to these conversations with, especially when they have contrary views from what you understand, that you're at least also open to hearing again, and then open to the possibility of shifting or modifying your own perception of what you see as your quote truth.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair to say?
It is definitely. I definitely appreciate that most of us do operate from our subjective realities. So I'm very interested in hearing what other people believe and how it is that they've come to make those conclusions.
So I want to give the acknowledgments. Christy has said, amazing, Miss McKenna. Love that. And then there's another comment from Joan. When you understand where the other person is coming from, you can connect with the emotion underneath the beliefs and forge a more constructive interaction.
I agree with that 100%.
And if you didn't agree with that, would you even say?
I would, yes, I try to be truthful.
Again, we're going to go back to the beginning of the show. Whose truth? Yours or mine?
My subjective truth.
And as we've also messaged today, that people can be simultaneously, quote, truth, speaking the truth, and also being, quote, wrong. Which, I mean, those are really strong words to say. And that's why I really encourage about the perspective of non-judgmental framing. That's about perspective sharing, points of view. You have your point of view, I have my point of view. I'm not right, you're not wrong. What I value is important to me, and what you value, I'm going to acknowledge that's important to you. When it crosses over to try to be imposed on me, and if it's something that's contrary to my perspective and my belief, that becomes problematic for me. And that's where we have to have these, challenging conversations to see what's underneath all that, what's behind that, and maybe there's something I can learn from what I don't know to what I could know, and that what I might do differently next time.
I would agree with that. And I think that those are all constructive steps to be taking. And I think the one key that you mentioned, Greg, is awareness, being mindful of the idea that maybe we just don't know. Maybe we need to be curious about other people, and maybe we need to understand that there is perhaps another answer.
Yeah, we have to, with the curiosity, as I mentioned, I don't know, an earlier show, the concept starts with not curiosity, it starts with that whole sense of openness. If we feel we're right and the others are wrong, that's a closed mind for me. And I think there's less probability to try to have that person be curious because they're only looking at things through their own lens and their own belief system and their own practice and their own mindset. If there's some opportunity for an individual to open themselves to the concept of, hey, maybe there's more to this and I could learn. So that's the asking the open-ended questions, because closed and leading questions are framed from the person asking the question for getting confirmation of what they believe to be, quote, the truth. And so for me, the difference of judgment with curiosity is that with judgment, we've already filled in the blanks about the situation of the person. And with curiosity, we're providing the space for the other person to self-express and self-define. And we want to be curious to hear that.
Agreed. And I think one of the things to be mindful of as well is that sometimes life really is a paradox. Most of the time, I think it's fair to say that we are right and wrong simultaneously. And if we look back on many of the conflicts that we've come through, most of us will say, I could have done this differently. I should have done that a little bit differently. I was just, I was so angry immediately. I just reacted rather than pausing for a little while and thinking about things. And it's a process.
Yeah, and processes take time. And I think it takes energy, it takes patience, it takes that whole thing of being open-minded. And comment from Christy, everyone thinks differently, and hearing another perspective might open your mind to a different view.
And we might be persuaded that way. That's exactly how we learn, and we might ourselves be persuaded in that way.
Or I'll even say we might be educated and informed that, hey, life isn't only through my own lens, my own lived experience, that there are others, and that's why I took an early view with the whole concept of diversity and difference, rather than being a barrier, an obstacle, an impasse. And it's like, when something's different, we go around it, we avoid it or evade it. It's actually something to be curious about, to be enriched, to be informed about, and go into it, and then we can grow and develop from that. So anybody have any comments, questions, because we have to truthfully sign off soon. Okay. All right. So I want to be respectful of you and everyone else. And thank you for everyone for joining tonight. Great conversation. So thanks for doing what you usually do. And we have these very good conversations together. And,
thank you very much for inviting me back. It's very, very honest and truthful of you. Thanks, Greg.
Well, you should hear what I say off air. No, that's totally, everything's transparent here. And so it's a great opportunity to have these provocative conversations. It's about stimulating for change. So thank you, Greg and Julie.
Thank you.
Acknowledgement for you. All right, so we're going to close, and we're going to see you again. And we encourage you to visit with us and attend next week for another different conversation, truthfully. And
excellent. Thank you very much.
We'll figure that out. And I'm encouraging you to explore that suggestion about the topic for another conversation.
I will.
Okay.
Excellent.
That'll be a rich one. All right. So have a good night, and we'll see you soon. And everyone stay safe and be well.
And thanks everyone for listening. That's great.